So it's my pleasure to introduce Sara Minkara, the U.S. Department of State's Special Advisor on International Disability Rights. As a Lebanese-American Muslim woman who acquired her disability at age 7, SAIDR Minkara brings a personal perspective to negotiating for humanity. She has dedicated her life to championing disability, inclusion, and empowering others to reach their full potential. A graduate of both Wellesley College's class of 2011 and the Harvard Kennedy School, SAIDR Minkara founded Empowerment Through Integration, otherwise known as ETI, a nonprofit supporting youth with disabilities. As well as founding ETI, she created her consulting firm, Sara Minkara LLC, to introduce concepts of adaptive design, leadership, and inclusion across sectors using her in-the-dark methodology. In 2021, SAIDR Minkara was appointed by President Biden to serve as the second Special Advisor on Disability Rights, following Judy Heumann, one of the founders of the American Disability Rights Movement. Since her appointment, SAIDR Minkara has used disability diplomacy to persuade international partners to reflect on why persons with disabilities are left behind, and how governments and civil society can empower persons with disabilities to showcase their value confidently and freely. Through these meaningful engagements, SAIDR Minkara aims to, as she would say, disrupt the narrative on persons with disabilities so that they may have full and equal participation across society. SAIDR Minkara's influence extends globally. She advised numerous government, academic, and policy groups, spoken at the United Nations, and engaged audiences across 5 continents. Her work has garnered notable recognition, including Forbes' 30 Under 30 list, Vital Voices' 100 Women Using Their Power to Empower, and more. With a deep understanding of human potential and a commitment to equitable access, SAIDR Minkara leads the U.S. in promoting and protecting disability rights worldwide. Please join me in welcoming her back to Wellesley.
Well, thank you so much for that really kind, long introduction. And I just want to first say a huge thank you to Wellesley Albright Institute. It's really wonderful to be back here at Wellesley. Also, a huge thanks to my professors who taught me here at Wellesley. And it's just, this community here means a lot to me. I'm also joined today by my partner in crime, as I call her, Hannah Nasri, who's sitting somewhere. Hannah, yeah, there we go. Awesome. Okay, so let's do this. Before I get started, I want everyone just to snap their hands. It helps me Okay, great, awesome. How are we doing today? Very good. Good? Okay, excited? Yes. Okay, so I'm actually going to introduce myself in a different way, and it's going to connect to the whole theme at hand. Promise me the following thing, guys. One is make this interactive, ask at any time, any question, just shout out your question. Don't raise your hand. I'm blind. I can't see you. So just shout out your question or your comment, but say your name too so I get to know you, okay? Sounds good? Yes. Great. Awesome. Okay, so let's get started. I'm a daughter. I'm a sister. I'm a friend. I'm a colleague. I'm a neighbor. I'm an introvert. I'm a traveler. I'm a troublemaker. I love math. I love horses, I love nature, I love the color green. I used to be able to see. If you ever want to make me happy, feed me chicken. I drink too much coffee. I'm a woman, I'm Muslim, I'm blind, I'm a person with a disability. And I'm very proud of it. So my first question is, why did I introduce myself this way?
To show us that you're, hi, I'm Insha, and I think it's to show us that you're more than just the disability. I think sometimes that can be a label that's just put on someone.
That's true. I'm multiple things, more than just my disability. That's true, definitely. What else?
I'm Arashi. To build a connection with us.
To build a connection with you, yes, definitely. What else?
Hi. I think also to share your lens before you explain your perspective on things.
Mm-hmm. To share my lens, to share who I am. Definitely. What else?
Hi, I'm Caitlin, and I think maybe also to tell us what's important to you and what you value.
Exactly. To tell you all what's important to me. To tell you guys who I am. What else?
Hi, I'm Bella, and it's very humanizing to hear about you and your interests outside of your expertise that you're about to tell us about.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. It's humanizing. Definitely. One more.
It creates a connection between you and the audience. My name's Elizabeth.
Definitely. Creates a connection between me and all of you. You know, we're all individuals with so many different identities, right? Some that are visible and some that are not visible, right? A lot of things I shared, you would never tell that about me if you looked at me, right? But we all share one common thing as humans across the globe. The desire to be seen, to be heard, and to be valued, right? Don't we all share that? We all share that desire. But the reality is, when it comes to persons with disability, we are not seen, we're not heard, and we're not valued. There are 1.3 billion individuals in this world with a disability. 1.3 billion, 17% of the world's population. And at most times, if we're seen from a certain lens. And here's my next question to you all. When society sees a person with a visible, and I'm saying visible disabilities here because there's a lot of us that have non-apparent disabilities. When society sees a person with a visible disability walking down the street, let's say a blind person with a white cane, what comes to mind?
They assume they need help.
They need help, definitely. What else?
My name is Susanna. Vulnerability.
Vulnerability, exactly. What else?
My name's Sylvia, and sometimes patronization or
Yeah. Patronization, being patronized, definitely. What else?
I'm Emmy. The first things that come to mind are the things you can't do, rather than the things you can.
Yep. Society focuses on what you cannot do instead of what you can do. Definitely. What else? I want 5 more.
My name is Amelia, and it almost makes me uncomfortable to even say this, but I think a lot of us are encouraged to feel a lot of pity.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thank you for saying that. Definitely. Pity. It's a big part of it. What else?
My name is Caitlin, and I think kind of going off of that, people sometimes feel uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Lots of discomfort. Yep. What else?
My name's Rebecca. I think a lot of the time people don't think about how their spaces are inaccessible until someone with a disability is in that space.
Yeah. Yeah. They don't recognize how much the space, the system is inaccessible. Definitely. What else? And when they think about accessibility, they see it as a favor or add-on. What else? 3 more. I'm trying to get somewhere.
My name is Zora,
Yes.
and I think people often think of like the space around like the person rather than the person himself.
That's true. Sometimes they think about the space around the person versus the person themselves. 2 more.
Hi, my name is Fatima. I think people have a tendency to maybe reduce the person to just the disability that they notice.
A lot of times we're just reduced to our disability. 1 more.
I think if people feel uncomfortable, they're more inclined to avoid what they feel uncomfortable with. So perhaps they can
Rather avoid than, yeah, definitely. So I would categorize narrative towards disability in society in 2 big buckets. The one big bucket is what we discussed here, is the charity, the pity. I feel bad for you. You're suffering. You're struggling. You need help. You're incapable. You're different. I'm afraid of having this. I'm uncomfortable. Awkwardness, right? I would bucket that into all one. The other bucket that I was trying to also see if anyone would bring it up is this bucket that we call as inspiration porn. Oh my God, you're so amazing. You're so courageous. You're so brave. Why? Because I'm just walking down the street on my own. If a person with a disability is married to a person without a disability, what's the narrative? To the person with a disability, you should feel so grateful. To the person without a disability, you're such an angel. These two extreme narratives are still very much present in our society. Some parts of the world where it's in your face, right? And people will come up to you and say certain things. Or it still exists in other parts in the world where it's so subtle, but it's still present. Even our societies here in the US. Disability is yet not normalized, and I'm using the word intentionally here, normalized, as an identity that exists and that we bring value. It's not normalized. Disability is still seen as a different thing, a special thing. Whenever someone turns to me and says, Sara, you're blind, you have special needs. Oh, I hate that word. And Hannah has seen me, even on TV interviews, I turn to that person while I say, well, I think you have special needs. They're like, whoa, what do you mean? Well, you need light because you can see. I don't need light. From my perspective, you have a special need. It's all about how we look at things. It's all about phrasings. Why don't we look at accessibility as a point of value? What do I mean by that? You know, the diversity of who we are as humans, including the diversity of disability, when we come in and we say, make this accessible, for instance, wheelchair, like ramps for wheelchair users, right? Make this accessible. Instead of seeing this, oh my God, it's a favor, it's an add-on, it's a costly thing, ugh. We actually turn around and say, actually, this is forcing our system to create more options of how we can navigate this world, where we can all benefit from, right? Because who benefits from ramps? Strollers. The Amazon delivery person. People with suitcases. But why do we still see as accessibility as an add-on? Why? And on top of that, when we're making a system inaccessible, what are we doing? We're preventing persons with disability to come to the table and contribute. So we're also losing out on their value and contribution. So not only are we losing out on more ways of how we can navigate the world, but also we're losing out on their value. Do you guys understand the two layers to that? Yeah. And when the narrative is still very much charity, pity, I feel bad for you, that's going to translate into how we develop policies. That's going to translate in terms of how do we develop infrastructure, spaces, systems, programs, services. And then that's going to impact our educational system, our employment systems, our transportation systems, and now our AI world. When we're still seen as vulnerable. I always tell people when they say, well, people with disabilities are vulnerable, I look at them and I say, I'm not vulnerable because I'm blind. I'm vulnerable because you're not including us. And the system is not accessible. Let's make that differentiation pretty clear. Vulnerability doesn't come from the fact that I'm disabled. Vulnerability comes from the fact that the system is not accessible. So narrative is so important to address because it's going to influence everything else. And it's going to result to the following reality. Hannah, can you read out the statistics? I don't know if we're at that.
Yes, we are at that slide. You and I are in sync. So like we said, there's about 17%, well, 16 to 17% of the world population has disabilities. This number, 80% of this number lives in the global south. Thank you so much. And persons with disabilities experience significant physical barriers as well as technological and societal barriers. 50% of children with disabilities in the global south and in developing regions do not attend school.
There are also even more horrifying statistics. Persons with disabilities are not employed usually, and 7% of GDP is lost when we don't employ persons with disabilities. And as you can see, some studies show that retention rates of employees of when you employ a person with disability is 85%, so you're losing out on that retention. Persons with disabilities and their families have $13 trillion in disposable income, so when we're not making websites accessible, things like that, we're losing out on that market. And on and on. There are so many more statistics, but I will let the special advisor continue.
So this gives you a small snapshot of the reality of the disability community globally. I mean, but it's even more real when you are on the ground and you meet family members and you meet students and you meet individuals with disabilities where they tell you, I am not seen and I'm not heard and I'm not valued. When you have shackling still happening for persons with disabilities in certain countries, shackling. When you have a huge challenge of institutionalizing persons with disabilities in countries like Ukraine that still exist. These are realities stemming from what? Stemming from the narrative that how society sees persons with disabilities. So let me take you now to how we do what we do and how we do our work. But before I do that, any questions or comments so far? Did you say no? Yes? Yes? No? Okay. No, okay. Any questions on this side? No. Hannah, time check. Where are we at?
We're at 150.
Great. Awesome. Okay, so keep these statistics in mind and keep the narrative in mind. So, the role of the Special Advisor on International Disability Rights. This role was actually established under President Obama, who at that time appointed Judy Heumann, as was mentioned in the introduction. She was an amazing legend. She actually passed away this past March, and led the effort of establishing the ADA with other advocates, and also helped establish the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. Amazing, amazing legend. Under the past administration, no one was appointed. So when I started, there was a gap between the Obama administration and this, and then in our administration right now. And I took a look at kind of where do we want to start? You know, our mission is advancing the rights of persons with disability across the globe. Oh Lord, that's really huge, with a really teeny tiny team. And I took a step back with a team and I said, disability rights, disability inclusion is an adaptive challenge versus a technical challenge. And what do I mean by that? A lot of times people want to give quick solutions to a bigger problem. I'll give you guys an example. I was in a country, Hannah and I, one of our first countries that we visited, and we met with the Minister of Labor at the time. And that Minister of Labor was talking to us about their quota law. And he said, Sara, we have a 2% quota law, which means every single company and government agency is required to employ 2% persons with disabilities. Of their employees need to be persons with disabilities. So first, before I say what happened, what are people's thoughts here about the quota law? Any thoughts?
My name's Bella,
Yes?
and it seems like they could easily treat it as a cap. Like, we're just going to hit this mark and we're not going to do anything more to adapt our practices or to make it so that more than 2% could enter our organizations.
Great, so that's one point. They can treat it as a cap, definitely. What else?
My name is Insha, and again, kind of going off of that, like, if the world population for people with disabilities is 17%, then that is like extremely low.
So we're not even representing the true population at hand, definitely. Yep. What else?
My name's Clara. So I think by having quota law, you somehow can easily trigger stereotype effect. Like people who get hired might think, oh, I'm only here because of my disability, not my competence.
And that happens, definitely. That's true. What else?
My name's Zora. I think that what they might do is use it like to just check off a box rather than actually caring about the people they're hiring.
Definitely. So, all of those points are real and valid. So here's what happened in this country. 2% law, and if you don't adhere to that 2% quota, you get fined. So what did companies do? Like, okay, we're gonna hire these people, put them on payroll, but tell them don't come to work. Can you guys believe that? Don't come into work. So for them, they checked off the box. They reached that 2% cap, and they said don't come into work. Technical solution to an adaptive problem. What's the real solution here, guys?
There and then, actually, like giving them a job and like letting them do their job, like employ them and like give them responsibilities.
Give them a job and let them do their job, definitely. What else?
My name's Lucia, and it would help if the actual narrative was changed and people with disabilities were seen as able to work and do jobs.
Yeah. That's one of the main variables for the barriers that people with disabilities face is the narrative, right? Companies don't think they're capable or worthy of hire. What else? We need to change the narrative. What else do we need to do?
My name's Rebecca. Working on changing the barriers that prevent disabled people from accessing jobs, and assuming that without those barriers, disabled people are capable of getting jobs in any circumstance.
Definitely. One more thought.
My name is Rachel. I think one thought is that some people to stay home is just an excuse not to actually have any adaptation within the workplace.
Exactly. So it's a systemic, many variables that lead to this adaptive challenge, right? Where people just want technical solutions. Great, quota law, you're done, we achieved it. Number one, you need to actually disrupt the narrative and get companies to see the value in employing persons with disabilities, that they're able to contribute. Number two, okay, they come into the work, but is the space accessible? Do they have the right accommodations? Is it adaptable? Number three, persons with disabilities also, are they even able to access applying to these jobs? Are they even to believe that they can do these, right? There's many layers to this challenge. Also, educational barriers. Let's take a step back. In order for us to achieve true full employment of persons with disabilities, we need to address all aspects of it. Quota laws can actually hurt than not help. So this goes back to our work that, one, we need to have an adaptive framework to this adaptive challenge. So there's a few variables to that when you want to address an adaptive challenge. Number one, you actually need to create spaces to have difficult conversations. And what is the difficult conversations? We need to start off with, how does society see people with disabilities? We actually need to have those conversations. And we have had those conversations now. We do them across the State Department and the White House. We do them when we travel the world and we meet with governments. We bring it to the table and say, let's start from the beginning. How do we see people with disabilities? We need to have those difficult conversations. Because people will come back and say, well, it's too costly. We don't have the budget. We don't have the resources. We don't have the technical capacity. All of that are not the real issue here. So let's create that space for difficult conversation. Second is we need to create shared responsibility. What do I mean by that? Internationally with our work, they end up wanting us just to meet with the Minister of Social Affairs and Labor Affairs and Education. But it's more than those ministries, right? It's the Ministry of Environment and Energy and Disaster Response and Finance, transportation, tourism, every single ministry needs to have a disability lens. How do we create more shared responsibility? From the narrative of the fact that when you include people with disabilities from the get-go and make the system accessible and inclusive, it's going to benefit your economy. And even internally in the State Department, when we first started, every single bureau and office would turn to us and be like, well, you take on the work, your disability policy. And I turn back and I say, actually, it's your job too. And one of our goals is when we leave the administration, my goal is for every single office in the State Department to be carrying this work forward. Because it should. The Global Health Office should have a disability lens. The Climate Action Office should have a disability lens. The Energy and Resources Office should have a disability lens. Every single office. But that's taking a lot of time and work, because sometimes people say, well, how does it really connect with my work? I'm like, let's sit down, let's talk about it. Let's talk about how first, when you don't include the disability community, you're losing out their value in innovation and contribution. But let's also talk about when you exclude persons with disabilities from the system, there could be a lot of harm and damage and cost on lives. Let's talk about climate action. People don't think about when emergency responses are not inclusive of disability, what ends up happening? Crisis happens, who's the first to be left behind? Disability community. So those are the conversations we need to have both internally and externally. And the third element to adaptive framework is building capacity. When you bring a person, so you're first having these difficult conversations, create shared responsibility. When you get to a point and a person says, yes, I'm interested, show me how, you need to be able to really support in building the capacity. Because a lot of governments out there are actually wanting to implement their disability policy, but they lack technical expertise. So building capacity and sharing best and good and promising practices is super important. Any questions so far before telling you more concretely what we've done? No? Okay. Definitely.
Olga Shortstop.
Ah! Hello.
I was really stricken by what you said about how inclusion and disability kind of rights should be in all offices of the government, not just siloed in sort of this one office that you're in charge of. And this really sounds to me like it parallels with DEI initiatives that are very much siloed in corporations, and how the person who is in charge of inclusion of underrepresented groups is usually just by themselves, and how indeed they should be included in all aspects of operations in firms. So how do you see translating what you're working on for government going farther and affecting the business world?
Such a good question. And that's something actually we've been trying to even push more intentionally in our office and also within how we look at disability inclusion. Because I'll be really honest, the disability community globally has pigeonholed themselves into one, I mean this is generalizing, but one or two sectors, which is the humanitarian assistant or aid sector, right? And something we've been trying to push and say we need to actually engage with the private sector more intentionally. We need to engage with investments and how we're investing. Right now, there's the Development Finance Corporation that we have for the U.S. government. How is the DFC looking at disability as a criteria in their investments? So that's something on one hand, getting the disability community to be more intentional about. And what we do is when we engage in any kind of travel, meeting with governments, we always meet with civil society as a start. We meet with the private sector and the AmCham, American Chamber of Commerce, and the businesses from there, media sector as well, and then of course government sectors, because it's more holistic, like you said. And the private sector, when we meet with them, their first point is like, oh, hiring persons with disability. We have this initiative. And then I try to expand and say, well, let's talk about your products, your services, your programs. How are they inclusive? So to your point, it's so easy for us to be pigeonholed, and we need to keep on pushing on that. And the disability community also needs to be expanding how they're doing their work. So really good question. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm Susanna. In regards to implementing inclusion, I think of my own sister. My sister has severe mental disabilities, and she often struggles with advocating for herself. And so I was wondering how you balance that some people are not able to go work, or like are not able to advocate for themselves. And so how do you ensure that like they are being advocated for, but then also respecting like maybe they don't actually want to advocate for themselves, or maybe they want to like they feel ashamed of their own disability, or like there's plenty of reasons. And so how do you advocate for a community who may not be able to advocate for themselves or even engage in the conversations to begin with?
Yep, definitely a really good question. So one of your points, sometimes as a person with a disability, and a lot of people with disabilities will agree with this point, we are tired. We don't want to. We're done advocating. I feel like that's our every day of our lives. We're done. Like, why do you expect us to advocate, right? Like, that is a real thing that we need to give a space and compassion towards that point. And this is where allyship is really important. And building out allyship, but I would say authentic allyship. And true allyship, and this goes back to your other question, is where the system around you, support system or allyship, is there to help be able to bring your voice forward. Even if the person might not be able to advocate for themselves, their voice is still important. Their perspective is still important. Their needs are still important. So how do we create true support system and allyship system that brings out the true authentic voice and perspective? And there's a lot of organizations out there. Inclusion International advocates a lot for people with intellectual and cognitive disabilities. There's a lot of organizations and support systems that allow for those voices to be heard, because we don't want ever a person not to feel valued and not to be heard. I want to also make a last point, which is a little bit different what you asked, but one of my biggest frustrations is society's trying to come up with different terms for persons with disabilities because they're uncomfortable with the word disabilities. And I turn to this person, I'm like, well, I am a person with a disability. I cannot see. It's part of who I am. That's a reality. Like, don't change that about me, but change how you look at my disability, right? Because you have other, for instance, UAE has come up with a term called persons with determination. Determination, not termination, determination. People sometimes mishear me. And for the disability community, like, well, what does that really mean? How does that even translate to what we're talking about here? And it's almost like avoiding addressing the elephant in the room. But also, as some would say, well, what if I don't want to be determined? I want to be like anyone else and sit back and be on my, So there's a lot of terms that are coming up to avoid the elephant in the room. Differently abled. Well, aren't we all differently abled? Like that's, so it goes back to what's the work at the center. So, any other questions? Great, awesome. So, what we do. We lead the US government foreign policy on disability all over the world. So we cover all 6 regions. We've actually been to 25 countries so far. This year we have another almost 20 countries on our list. So it's a pretty extensive list this year. And we approach our work through not only a human rights lens, but also a value-based lens. And that's the lens I was talking to you guys about earlier on. And we have 4 main priorities that we've laid out as a team. Number 1, fostering accountability and building capacity. I'll explain that in a sec. I'll explain each one in a sec. So number 1 is fostering accountability and building capacity. Number 2, promoting disability inclusive democracy. Number 3, advancing the rights of persons with disabilities during moments of crisis. And number 4, disrupting the narrative on disability, okay? So for the first one, most countries have ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I definitely recommend all of you guys look this up afterwards, read on it. It's almost like the ADA version of for the international community. So most countries have ratified this, except for us, by the way, the US, and we can go into that why that, but but the ADA kind of helped build out the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. But the reality on the ground is very different from what they've ratified. Why is that the reality? So most countries have ratified the CRPD. And
hi, I'm Jenna. A lot of international agreement stuff with enforcement mechanisms.
Enforcement mechanisms is one of them, definitely. What else?
Hi, I'm Caitlin, and a lot of times disagreements don't really account for the fact that you have to change people's minds.
Definitely. Changing people's minds, because policies is one thing, but who implements policies is people. What else?
These might be like regional initiatives, but you have to like implement them at like a local level, and it has to be like built into the local, I guess, like agenda.
How do you localize them to the local context? Definitely. One more.
Capacity, like finances, human resources, and then an unwillingness to reallocate or like these resources toward implementing this agenda.
Exactly. So, enforcement provisions, adapting it to the local context, having the technical expertise and the financial capacities to actually implement these laws, right? All of these, and the narrative as well, all of these come into play. So that's why one of our main priority is, okay, how do we foster more accountability and how do we build capacity? So we do this through our bilateral engagement, through the countries that we visited. We support countries either with implementing certain disability laws, or we provide them technical expertise on certain issue sets, and we support them in building out and implementing their policies. So I'll give you an example. When we were out in Romania, they had recently passed an inclusive education law, and the minister turned to me and she's like, we need support in terms of how do we translate into reality. So this is where then we connect them to our Department of Education, to our technical expertise, so they can start the dialogue of how can they really bring forward expertise to the ground. Or we also have something called the IVLP mechanism, International Visitor Leadership Program, where we're able, through the State Department and our embassies, send folks from the country to the US on a certain issue set and have them connect with folks folks who have these expertise on this issue sets. So there's different ways for us to really help take that forward and help them connect them with expertise to build out their capacities, or show them how to do more enforcement provisions, or also have honest and open conversations and difficult conversations. Say, you actually need to have budget attached to this. Where's your line item for this? So all of this is really important. But then we also do this on a multilateral level. So one example is, one of the regions that's really important to the US is the ASEAN world. Do you guys know what the ASEAN region is? It's the Southeast Asia. So that's Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Brunei, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Myanmar. I didn't miss any of them, right? Thailand, yes. So this region is a community. It's a region where they come together and they do a lot of regional relationship with US or Japan, Korea, China, Australia. So US-ASEAN relationship, they have different foreign policy conversations, and we call them dialogue. And this past year, we were able to launch the first ever US-ASEAN dialogue on disability, and it was a ministerial level with Indonesia. This was huge on a few different layers. Why? First, it signaled to both the US and ASEAN in their relationship, disability is important. It's important when we talk about peace, security, and prosperity. Number two, it also signaled to each country and their ministers, because it was the Minister of Social Affairs that led this dialogue, that disability is an important issue that they're able to bring forward to their own community. And we're able to bring civil society to the rooms and to the table, which was really huge. So that's one example that, and from there, Lao signaled, because Lao has a chair this year, say we want to continue this work forward. So how do we keep building this out in a way that disability is seen more than just a cute thing to do? Same thing with Central Asia. C5+1, the 5 Central Asian countries, and the 1 is the US. And we have a relationship with them on a regional level in terms of energy, commerce, investment. And this past year, we were able to have President Biden include disability as one of the initiatives. And that's huge for both the foreign policy world, but also for the disability community. And then last example is, there's many more, but one last example that I'll mention here is China. There's not that many things we can engage with on China, except one of the few things is disability. So we did a US-China coordination meeting. We don't call them dialogues for certain reasons, but they're called coordination meetings early in November where they hosted us. And they took us to a few different provinces and regions, but they really were open to learning about best practices from the US as they are implementing their Barrier-Free Act law. So huge. Huge on a global scale, foreign policy, huge for the disability community, and also huge for our economy. Because the more we're inclusive of disability, the more that's going to help the economies. So any questions on priority 1? No. What's the time check?
We are at 2:15,
sorry. Okay, great, awesome. Priority 2. Promoting disability inclusive democracy. So this is one of our main priorities because ultimately we want to ensure that people with disabilities' voices are heard as we build out systems and democracies and political participation. And unfortunately, persons with disabilities have many barriers when it comes to disability inclusive democracy. One barrier, very clear, a lot of places where voting booths happen, they're not accessible. How do we make sure where people are able to access and vote and be able to participate? That's one clear, simple, but it's a challenge across the world. Access to elections. Number 2, there's a lot of laws and legislations around the world where it prohibits certain disabilities and persons with disabilities to actually vote. It's actually really bad. So this is where we work with countries to really adjust or adapt their policies. And we also work with civil society organizations like IFES, NDI, and IRI. So IFES, International Foundation of Electoral Systems, NDI, National Democratic Institution, IRI, International Republican Institution?
I really can't remember.
Anyways, whatever. You guys can look it up. But these are, a lot of times, our partners on the ground and really important. And we've worked in Nigeria before their elections. We worked with Mozambique on their legislation. We've had certain conversation actually in Iraq because the situation there is really, when it comes to persons with disabilities and elections, not good. But we've also launched a disability inclusive democracy cohort through the Summit for Democracy. And that's led by Australia and IFES. And that's bringing together civil society, private sector, government sector, coming all together to discuss best, good, and promising practices on democracy. And then we're headed out to Korea in March, because Korea is hosting Summit for Democracy this year. So we need to keep on ensuring people with disabilities can vote, can politically participate, can run for office. There's a lot of political parties that, again, there's a quota law that, the lists have to include 2 people with disabilities on their list. So what they end up doing is just finding any random 2 people and putting them on the list. And same issue, right? So we need to ensure, or you have a country like Egypt where members of parliament with disabilities are just appointed, they're just brought to, So we need to actually ensure that people with disabilities are able to run for office, influence policies, bring their voices forward, and not on just disability policy issues, but on every single other policy. So this is kind of one of our main priorities. Any questions on this priority? Tell me.
Hi, so my name is Nadine, and we've been talking a lot about developing nations. So I'm just wondering, how do you get developing nations that also have other pressing issues to prioritize bettering disability rights for their citizens?
That's a good question. I mean, one is disability is cross-cutting, right? And the other pressing issues probably are also relevant to disability. So that's number one. But number two as well, I will say you cannot, if you exclude disability from the get-go, it's going to cost you much later on. I'll give you guys an example. Right now, Ukraine. There's a lot of aid investment going into reconstruction and recovery for Ukraine. And I joined the Secretary of State this past June in London for the Ukraine Recovery Conference. And it was all the donor countries and EU and everyone coming together and talking about recovery and reconstruction. Not a single country besides us brought up accessibility when it comes to reconstruction and recovery, which is a missed opportunity. Why? Yes, they're in the midst of war. Yes, it's going to be hard. How do we enforce it and make it more localized? But one is they're going to have a new batch of population, veterans with disabilities as well. Not only the existing disability community, but we're going to have another community with disabilities because of war. And if you don't include accessibility into the recovery and reconstruction, it might cost you, and it's statistically shown that it's cost just 3 to 5% more. But if you don't include it, then you're creating more barriers for them to then being able to reintegrate into society and contribute into the economy. So we need to keep enforcing this and bringing forward this concept that might cost a little bit more in the short term. Yes, you have a lot of issues going on, but for the long run, it's going to benefit you. Any other questions? Okay, well, number 3, and we talked a little bit about it now, crisis. So crisis, unfortunately, is a big part of our reality, whether we all experience COVID, whether climate disaster, but also conflict. In crisis, there's a life cycle for crisis. Number 1, in a place before a crisis happens, most countries have something called, emergency planning. And we need to ensure disability and accessibility is baked into emergency plans. And something we've been trying to do more and learn more is how FEMA has done it and how can we bring forward what FEMA has done to the global community, for instance. Because when a crisis hits, and we see this over and over again, the first community that's left behind is the disability community. And the first few months during the Ukraine, when the Ukraine conflict started, the disability community they were telling us, the government is not thinking of us, evacuations is not accessible, bomb shelters are not accessible, humanitarian assistance is not reaching us. A lot of this could have been addressed if emergency response, not all of it, a lot of it. I'm going to be clear on this. A lot of it, not all of it, could have been addressed if emergency planning and crisis planning was inclusive and accessible for persons with disabilities. So 1, emergency planning, then responding to a crisis, then negotiation and peace building, and ensuring the disability community is at the table, and understanding you cannot achieve full peace in a society if there's still trauma and mental health. Addressing trauma and mental health is really important to achieve full peace within a society. And then lastly is recovery and reconstruction, and that's what we talked about Ukraine. Does that make sense? All of these different elements? And these are different points, entry points for us that we engage within the State Department and the National Security Council. And unfortunately, when a conflict or crisis happens, there's so many different hands and arms and people, and our goal is still to mainstream disability into how the US government approaches a crisis internationally, and how do we institutionalize this? And of course, each crisis is different, and each crisis is going to be dealt in a different way, but our goal is to mainstream this in our US government, but our goal is also to talk to governments and help them mainstream it. We are focusing a lot on Ukraine, and we're focusing a lot on Gaza. On Gaza, what we're focusing on is, one, people in northern Gaza with disabilities cannot evacuate. And as some would say, asking a person with a disability to evacuate is like asking them to fly. So them and their family are left behind. Humanitarian assistance is not reaching them. And any humanitarian assistance that's coming in is not also addressing the needs of persons with disability. There's so many different challenges. So what we've been doing is amplifying those voices and perspectives across the US government. And we actually held a listening session at the National Security Council, bringing in the disability voices from Gaza and others to share what they're experiencing and what's happening, and how can we ensure that some of that is integrated into the National Security Council and State Department's approach. And the stories that we heard, one example is a blind father did not know how to evacuate him and his kids, and then a few days later he was killed. And this is us in touch with these different communities on the ground. So our goal is to make sure people with disabilities' voices are heard. So that's on the crisis stuff. I wish our office is so small and mighty. There's a lot of other issues like climate action. John Kerry, our special presidential envoy for climate, how do they take forward disability in their work? We have a global health office. How do they take disability in their work with a health crisis? Ultimately, we want to make sure everyone takes forward this work. Any questions or comments on this? Yes,
So you talked a little bit about the U.S. Do you know of any other countries that might have have shown successful ways to kind of do this kind of crisis planning, or that kind of question?
Yeah, it's a really good question. This goes back to our goal. One of our goals is to constantly share best practices, good and promising practices from all over the world. Even from countries where we might not expect it, there's sometimes amazing, localized, beautiful solutions. Like in Nigeria, there's civil societies focusing on crisis and disability. So we are always trying to share these practices with our embassies, but also with international communities. One example is this year, there's going to be the first ever G7 Disability Ministerial Political Track meeting with the G7 countries. And one of the goals is how do we make sure we're bringing these practices to that community so then they can share it to their own community. So really good question. And that's one thing that we as a disability community sometimes have a challenge with, is sharing best practices, expanding it beyond our disability community, telling more of the stories of value, and being able to bring people along that are not part of the disability community. So really good question. Any other questions? Okay, time check, Hannah? Okay, great. Priority 4, last but not least priority, disrupting the narrative. This is my favorite. And our goal is to disrupt the narrative internally in the State Department and the White House, and externally. And to be honest, internally, we become a pain in the butt. But that's the way to go. And it's literally us, internally, it's us making sure our teams are clearing on papers across the board to mainstream disability. We're always left out. Us always doing readouts with our colleagues to share what we're doing. Us getting offices and bureaus and doing a disability 101 training with them and having difficult conversations, and ultimately having disability be mainstream into their strategies and their approach. So that's a lot of what we do internally. Externally, we do this in a few different ways. One is actually bringing disability to multilateral spaces and global spaces that are not typically seen. As I mentioned, G7, that's a huge, huge outcome. That Italy actually is launching the first ever G7 Disability Summit, and hopefully this will continue forward. APEC with Peru, ASEAN with Laos, C5+1, all these multilateral spaces bringing and mainstreaming disability. I'll tell you a little bit about APEC. APEC, the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. 21, or is it 22 countries? I don't remember. Or as they say, economies, coming together and talk about economic opportunities. This past year, US had the chair for APEC, and we were able to mainstream disability to some level, okay? Great. We mainstreamed it into the Women Economy Forum, into the Human Resource Development Working Group, but there was more work to be done. But because we did some touch points, the APEC Secretariat reached out to us and said, Sara, we would love to mainstream disability across all of APEC working streams. Huge. And that institutionalizes the work, that mainstreams the work, and that work will last beyond our time, right? That's the goal for us, disrupting the narrative in a way that people see how disability can fit in across different sectors, different themes, different working streams, and how it can benefit their own work. So that's one layer. Second layer is media engagement, working with the entertainment industry, and even having engagement with other partners from the tech industry, private sector, academia, just having these different dialogues. So that's a lot of our work, is disrupting the narrative and coming to someone and saying, hey, have you thought about AI and disability? Well, actually, no, I haven't thought. Let's have a conversation. It starts from there. Any questions on this one?
I have a question, Susanna again. Regarding disrupting the narrative, oftentimes caregivers aren't a part of the narrative. And so how do you incorporate the larger community of disability into your work and into disrupting the narrative?
So there's a lot of care economy reforms happening, right, post-COVID, and run a lot of by women-led organizations and women movements, which is really important. But what's been left out from that conversation is the disability perspective, and also understanding that persons with disabilities can be both caregivers and care receivers. We're not just care receivers. And also, if caregivers, if we're focusing, the women-led, like the care economy reforms are focusing a lot on caregivers and not really understanding how this is going to impact care receivers, you know, we need to address both sides. We also need to address that people with disabilities can be both as well, either or. We need to also understand that it's a systemic issue. So to your point, there's a lot of conversations, but a lot of times it's happening on one side or the other side. And we need to make sure we're bringing both conversations forward. So it's a really good question, but there isn't right now. We're trying to really bring the disability community to these other discussion points, these other conversations as well. Any other questions? Yes, tell me.
Maybe again. So I just keep thinking of like the global south, and yesterday we had different talks about how it's important that we prioritize the people who are being affected in these countries, and that we center the work that is already happening there. So I'm just wondering, like, what steps is your office taking to ensure that you're not disrupting like any of the grassroots level work that is already happening in those countries to advance like disability rights?
So a really good question. So ultimately, the way our office approaches things is we actually encourage, and one of the things that we always do is we get civil society, grassroots organizations that are doing the great work, and we make sure that our embassies, U.S. embassies, are actually in touch with them. They bring them along, they understand what they're doing, and they're also integrated into other programming. So one of our goals is to keep on empowering and bringing forward the voices of the grassroots level organizations. Because they're doing the hard work on the ground. They know how to localize the work on the ground. And to be honest, I come from a grassroots level, so I understand also the importance of also partnership. Did that answer the question?
Yes.
Awesome. Any other questions? Yes, dear.
I have a question. My name is Asma. How do you deal with maybe like countries or entities that don't prioritize disability rights, and there's no voice for people who have disabilities, like from those countries? How do you help communities like that?
That's a good question. I'll be real, most countries don't prioritize it. I mean, that's the reality. And when we go visit, they'll show us what they're doing, and there's almost like, oh, great, and they'll bring that tokenistic whatever. So the way we've been trying to do more and more of, again, showing them the economic value of disability inclusion. And, ultimately, and I remember one time this person pushed back on me, and he's like, well, Sara, I don't want it just to be an economic opportunity. It's my right to be included. I was like, I understand it's your right. But some people in some countries and some spaces will not prioritize it unless they see the value or the economic value. So our goal is when we talk to countries, one, we always ensure that civil society is brought forward where their voices are heard as government are doing policy, developing policy, implementing policy. That's a really important thing that we always do. Number two, we ensure also then that our embassies can carry that work forward. We go on the ground, we almost like catalyze and start the conversation and bring people together, and we tell embassy, please take this forward in this way, right? And we want to make sure that this is going to be ongoing, constant engagement with government. Number three, it's also trying to help the disability community integrate and mainstream into other efforts, whether it's democracy effort, women's rights movement effort, climate action effort. How do we take their voices and be integrated into that? Because then their voices will be even much stronger. So there's different ways, but ultimately, I wish I can tell you that, a lot of countries actually don't prioritize disability. So that's a big part of our challenge. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, so a couple more things, and I'm going to turn it over to you for guys' questions, just general questions. So those are our 4 main priorities. Give you guys a snapshot of what we do. Ultimately, as we discussed, disability is cross-cutting. It's part of, I would say it should be part of every single sector, every single discussion, every single space. And we need to also recognize a lot of disability is not visible, and that's really important for us to recognize. And we also need to recognize there's a phrase in the disability community, nothing about us without us, right? Have you guys heard of this? Yeah. I will always say, let's take it a step further. And let's say, nothing without us. We should be everywhere. Some people will tell me, well, Sara, and they say this to other communities, just come into the room, come up to the table, bring a chair up to the table if you have no seat at the table. And I turn to these people and I say, that's great and all, but for some people with disabilities, it's not even accessible to get into the room. We need to actually really, truly journey map disability and their experiences and the accessibility barriers and break them down and look at inclusion not from a point of compliance, which a lot of us do, but from a point of opportunity and breaking down barriers so we can actually have more benefit from more of their value. That's an important distinction. We need to understand that when we're not including the disability community, we're losing out. So here's my ask of you now. Number one, how do you see disability be part of your majors and your work and your future careers? Any thoughts?
My name is Amelia. I'm interested in spatial design, in particular architecture as it applies to homes and cities. And I think accessibility is very at the front of this field, and I feel like it's something that's a key consideration if you're designing spaces for community, that every single member of the community has to be included.
Yep, I love that. Spatial design, universal design. And how do we, it is a big part of that, and how do we get even, I'll give you guys share a small story. I was talking to an individual that has a company that's developing these low-cost, climate-resilient homes for countries and spaces and low-income countries, okay? And I turned to him, I was like, oh, this is amazing. And I asked him the question, I was like, are they accessible? And he was like, oh, no, I never thought of that. And I was like, interesting. And I always try to make sure I don't say everything on my mind, because I was like, how did you not think of that? Anyways, but ultimately, for me, it's also like, not only the disability community, but also as people age, right? As we age, we need our homes to be more accessible. It's just, that's the reality. And we just tend to not think of these things, but that's great. Awesome. Any other, what else can we do? How is disability part of our work, our studies, our futures?
I can go. As someone, I'm interested in research, and that's just a broad interest of mine. So hearing perspectives from people with disabilities, I feel like they're often not heard as much or as broadly as others.
Definitely, and that's what something we were talking earlier on here. Like, there's not that much data out there and research out there on disability. And that's a huge missed opportunity. Huge. And that actually can further marginalize us. And also it can prevent us from telling more of the story of value. I'll give you guys one point. I will talk about how AI is built and based on what? Data. And there's limited data out there on disability, and the data even out there is very much biased. So what ends up happening is AI is being developed in a way that will be biased towards disability. One example, a lot of companies now use AI as the first layer of interviewing when people are being interviewed for a job, right? It'll be a video interview, and a lot of people with disabilities will be canceled out. Why? Because they'll see that person doesn't have, quote unquote, the normal behavior, body language, eye contact. So what? They're canceled. This is based on biased data. We need to make sure that disability and data and research is very much part of our work. But we're always forgotten. Other points, other ideas.
I'm interested in speech-language pathology. A lot of the curriculum and everything that exists doesn't necessarily include the input of people with disabilities, or have that lens to it all the time.
Yeah. And that's super important. We need to make sure people with disability voices are part of the development of those curriculums, definitely. What else?
My name's Rebecca. I want to be an educator, and I think I'm also a gender studies major, and so I think about this, to be honest, I do more with gender than I do with disability, which is what I should work on, but the ways in which difference increases creativity and ingenuity in especially educational spaces. I think something that was really drilled into me in school environments is that tactile or kinesthetic learning is very important for personal development, and that's something that emerges specifically from having disabled educators and disabled students in the classroom who need non-auditory or visual learning mechanisms.
Yep, definitely. And that knowledge and skill set of inclusive education is really important. And like you said, when you have a diverse student population, it benefits everyone. And I remember a lot of times when I took math classes, a lot of my classmates loved it because the professors would read more what was on the board because I can't see. And they benefited from that, right? When you add diversity to the population, it's adding more ways of navigating. Other examples?
Yeah, my name is Caitlin. Kind of going off of what both you and Rebecca have said, I'm a neuroscience major, and this past semester we talked a lot about neurodiversity. And I guess I was lucky in that my professor, she was really passionate about this and how a lot of the things that help people with different types of neurodiversity are actually good for everyone to learn better. Yeah.
And to your point, Microsoft actually has developed a program hiring people with neurodiversity, and it's actually benefited the entire company. Definitely. What else?
My name is Zora. I'm interested in making education more accessible through social media and also documentary studies. And part of that could be just bringing awareness to smaller things. Particularly right now, I'm interested in hair discrimination and things like that, in the Black community in particular. And I've noticed some things on social media, seeing people trying to make salons more accessible at this rate. So bring attention to things like that.
I love that. That's amazing. That's amazing. What else?
My name's Bijan, and I plan on going into teaching, and something that we think about a lot is how people with disabilities aren't included in history textbooks, despite being gravitating to something that I think about a lot.
That's true. And we should definitely always encourage, it's so true. They're not included in history textbooks. Or they might be included, but they're not, people don't know that Thomas Edison had a disability. Or, so there's a lot of people with disabilities in history, but their disability is not brought forward as part of their identity. Other questions? Other comments?
Thinking of the disabilities and disclosure and all that, I have a question for you.
Yes, tell me.
How can we make sure that we make our spaces accessible while also being respectful of people's boundaries and them not wanting to disclose their disabilities?
So really good question. First, before I talk about it like on a one-to-one level, but first understanding accessibility of a space is the physical space, the technological space, communication, also policies, procedures, and systems. All of these, right? It's not just the space itself. And the narrative. So those are different layers of accessibility. When you have a fully accessible system and society, you need to address those different variables. Now, here's what I do with my employees, and this can translate into your friends, your peers, your students, whatever, right? When I hire someone, I just ask, and I ask everyone this. I don't ask just my colleagues with disabilities. I have to ask everyone, what do you need to thrive in this working setting? That question allows for this person to just bring their voice and tell me what they need. It's not attached to anything. We all have needs, right? All of you in this room need light. So you guys can tell me, yeah, I need light. Whatever. I'm just, we all have needs. So by asking that question to your friends, to your colleagues, to everyone, what do you need to thrive in this space? That allows for an open and authentic conversation with no labels. And I always say this concept of curiosity through a lens of compassion. I want people to keep asking each other questions, but through a lens of compassion. Get to know one another. But it's a difference when someone comes up to me like, oh my God, your life must be so hard. How did you live it? Versus, tell me about your life, right? Same question, but one has an assumption. It's a really good question, so thank you. Any other questions or comments? Hannah, time check? Okay, so last 15 minutes is to you all. Questions for you to ask me, or any final comments before we wrap up.
Hi, I'm Courtney. I have a question regarding your role in doing disability diplomacy. Are you ever, is this a concern? Sorry. One question I have that we were discussing in a previous lecture is how, for example, global health issues will be, HIV will be acted upon by the U.S. government when it's politically beneficial to them or something like that. And is this something that you're concerned with at all in your work at state? Whether disability rights or disability inclusion could be used as political tools by the government or by other governments, and how is this something that you think through in your everyday work?
That's a really good question. So there's two layers to this. One, I feel like disability is a very neutral issue set and does not get politicized that much, which is a good thing for us. But it's a double-edged sword where no one will disagree. If I say, hey, let's do disability inclusion, no one will ever disagree, right? But our problem, similar to what we said earlier, is our problem, no one really prioritizes it. That's our issue, to be honest. It's less about being politicized. The other answer to this is I've had colleagues from, I would be traveling to this country, and they're like, Sara, can you please not go now because I don't want them to use what they're doing on disability to deflect from the other human rights violations they're doing. And for me, I'm like, well, to be honest, there's also important work to be done on disability in that country too. Some countries might say, oh, we're doing great things on disability, but every country still is on their journey. No one's perfect. So, I push back on people that prioritize one human right over another. One cannot do that, right? And just because we're not seen doesn't mean that our human rights are not being violated, if that makes sense. So ultimately, to answer your question, it's not yet been, I don't have a fear of that. My fear is also always, how do we make sure people keep taking that work forward? Because then if not, they will be forgotten. Any other questions?
Zora, again. There's quite a few educators in the room.
Yeah.
I've been trying to think of how in primary schools, especially like when kids are young and their minds are still very malleable, how to really disrupt the narrative so that we start doing that early on so that they grow into respectful adults. Your thoughts?
I mean, I totally agree. I think the earlier that we start, the better. I think also when you look at kids when they're really, really young, they have not internalized ableism, which is beautiful. You actually see the pure interaction between each other. Someone, for instance, if someone cannot see, great, okay, that's great. We'll just find another way to play together, you know? Curriculum, when we tell stories, how much of the stories have disability character? When you tell history, I think the earlier that we can integrate disability into the curriculum, into how teachers do it and teach, into the space, into how if you bring accessibility features immediately into the technology that we use, into making sure students with disabilities are with their peers, so all of these things from the beginning, then normalizes disability in a very beautiful way. Good question. Any other comments, questions?
Yes. Again, kind of going off of Zora's point, but more like in a college setting. Like I know, like how could we as students kind of advocate for better like accommodations, especially like I know like Wellesley like accommodations for like extra time for testing or like housing. Like how as new students who like don't necessarily yet have like influence in terms of like leverage and stuff, like and advocate for that.
Yeah. I think building. I mean, it depends on each, and it's. Getting accommodations is always one of the biggest challenges in any space, whether college, university, even in a work setting. And sometimes it can feel a very lonely process, and you're alone in this, and it could be really tough. And I've experienced this in many different ways, right? And what's really important is allyship, and being able to support one another, and building out coalition, and getting allyships from faculty, because there are a lot of great faculties, and I know here at Wellesley that really, for me, were a huge support, right? Getting allyships from faculty, allyships from other students, allyships from also administration staff, who get this, who can support, who can amplify these voices, because, you know, it could be a very lonely process, definitely. Any other questions?
Yes. I wanted to know more about how you connect with grassroots community organizations in other countries, especially if those voices are being like silenced or sidelined.
Mm-hmm. Really good question. So what we do first in any country, when we travel to it, we first, our embassy are kind of our control officers as they build out a trip, right? And they then, I always tell them, please organize a civil society roundtable early on. So grassroots level organizations, NGOs. But what we also do is then we reach out to our network, which is like the International Disability Alliance and other organizations, and ask them, who else do you recommend that we meet with? Because the U.S. Embassy might not know everyone, or they just might be in touch with their own network. And then we also talk to folks who are from those countries. So for instance, this past week we met with Claudia, what's her last name, Hannah? Gordon. You know, because we're headed to Jamaica next week. And Claudia Gordon is Jamaican American. So she gave us a whole list of people that we should meet with on the ground. So we're always asking. Our embassy is our first step, but we don't stop there, if that makes sense. Because we know that there's more voices to be heard from. Other questions?
Hi, I'm Cielo. I had a question from a policy advocacy standpoint. What reasoning do you see being presented as sort of counter to inclusive policymaking? Are people saying that it's not feasible, it's not in the budget, or we have a different priority, and how do you respond to that? And also, what do you see as sort of the real reason why people sort of work against inclusive policymaking?
It's a really good question. The main two reasons a lot of people say is it's costly or it's too difficult. And you're American, of course you have everything, and we don't have the resources, right? And I remember I was in a country where I was meeting with the Minister of Education, and we were trying to talk to her about we need to build more inclusive education, and then she was like, well, no, not every student has the right to go into inclusive education. And I was like, no, actually, I mean, students with disabilities can be in inclusive settings. And we went back and forth. She's like, no, it's too difficult, right? So to address that, so call budget and difficult. To address that, what I've seen is when you show them the how, and show them examples of how it's done, not just in the US, but in other countries, right? That allows them to take it forward more, if that makes sense. The how is an important step. Because when you show the how, then people are like, okay, this is not actually as hard as I thought it was. The budget thing, it goes back to even here, prioritizing in budget. And I will say, even in the State Department, for instance, we're trying to say, you need to mainstream disability accessibility into all of your budgets, right? It needs to be mainstreamed. Mainstreaming disability into a budget it goes back to mindset narrative and seeing the value, and seeing this is a value for your government and system at large. And that takes a longer kind of effort. But I would say that showing the how is the biggest part. Of course. Other question? Okay, last question. Yes.
How do you hold countries accountable in a lot of these meetings where you will have discussions about, this is what we want to prioritize with, how can all of our governments and communities and the civil societies have the disability rights in place? How do you actually hold countries accountable if they ever waiver from those, or what systems do you have in place to maybe gauge and actively monitor how they're doing the progress?
Yeah, that's a good question. It depends. There's different mechanisms. There's, of course, if a country allows for a really vibrant civil society community, civil society is always the best way to hold your government accountable. And then we support in ensuring that civil society has the support and that their voices be brought forward. That's one mechanism. Another mechanism is multilateral spaces. A lot of countries want to show what they're doing, right, to their peers. So in the ASEAN world, or in the APEC world, or in the in the C5 world. I'll give you guys an example. We did a town hall with all the Central Asian ambassadors in DC, and they all came and they're telling us what they're doing on disability inclusion, right? They want to show to their country peers that they're doing a good job. So that competitive aspect gives another edge to it. And sometimes, when the U.S. says, we would love for you guys to focus on we can't, enforce it, but we would encourage it, right? There's different ways, but ultimately you want it to be owned locally by the country. You want it to be owned by the people. You want the people to see the value in it. That's the ultimate goal. So I always go back to the importance of civil society. That's a good question. Okay, well, my ask, everyone, please take disability inclusion forward in your work and ask others, and just keep on expanding that network, because I would hope everyone takes forward disability inclusion. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate it.